Learn English through story. The last call he ever took. The phone rang at precisely 11:47 p.m. Raymond Carter had always believed that nothing good ever came from late-night calls. His years as a corporate lawyer had drilled that into him: emergency meetings, last-minute contract disputes, desperate clients trying to rewrite their mistakes under the cover of darkness. He had learned, through bitter experience, that the human tendency to seek redemption always struck hardest in the dead of night. But this call was different. It was not a panicked client or a demanding senior partner from the firm. It was a number he did not recognize. A moment of hesitation flickered across his tired face as he stared at the screen, debating whether to let it ring out. But something, perhaps instinct, perhaps fate, made him answer. "Hello." His voice was thick with exhaustion. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, a whisper, "Ray." The voice sent a cold tremor through him. It was soft, hesitant, and unmistakably familiar. Yet it was a voice he had not heard in almost 25 years. "Who is this?" he asked, though he already knew. The silence stretched again before the voice returned, this time steadier. "It's me, Evelyn." Raymond felt his grip tighten around the phone. The name alone was enough to send a sharp pang through his chest. Evelyn Pierce, the woman he had once promised to love forever, the woman he had betrayed. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "Evelyn," he murmured, as if saying her name aloud would make sense of the impossibility of this call. "It's been a long time." "Too long," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A strange mix of emotions flooded him: guilt, nostalgia, curiosity. He had spent years convincing himself that their past belonged in a locked box, hidden beneath layers of ambition and denial. He had built walls around those memories, hoping time would erode them into nothing. But hearing her voice now, it was as if no time had passed at all. "Why are you calling me?" he asked finally. There was another pause. Then she spoke the words that would change everything. "Ray, I'm dying." A sharp breath caught in his throat. The room, dimly lit by the soft glow of his desk lamp, suddenly felt suffocating. "What?" His voice was hoarse. "I don't have much time left," she said. "I had just needed to hear your voice. One last time." The finality in her tone sent a wave of dread through him. He had spent years chasing power, success. Well, everything he once thought mattered. But in that moment, none of it did. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, but only one question escaped his lips. "Where are you?" Evelyn hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't tell him. But then, softly, she whispered the name of a town, a place he hadn't thought about in years. The town where they had fallen in love. The town where he had left her behind. Raymond felt something shift inside him, something irreversible. And for the first time in decades, he knew exactly what he had to do. Raymond sat in silence long after the call had ended, the phone still clutched in his hand. The weight of Evelyn's words pressed down on him like a heavy stone in his chest. "I'm dying." He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office. Below, the streets of Manhattan pulsed with life: yellow cabs, neon lights, the never-ending hum of ambition. It was a world he had built himself into, brick by brick, deal by deal. But now, none of it felt real. Instead, his mind was elsewhere, back in a place he had abandoned long ago. He had not been to Ridgeway in over 20 years. It was a small, forgotten town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the world moved slower, where people still knew each other's names, where life was measured in the changing of seasons rather than in billable hours. It was where he had grown up. It was where he had met Evelyn. And it was where he had left her. Raymond swallowed hard. After all these years, he had convinced himself that what he did had been necessary, that leaving was the only way to become the man he needed to be. But now, in the sterile silence of his office, he found himself questioning everything. Could he face her? Did he even deserve to? The thought gnawed at him as he drove home that night, the city lights flashing past in streaks of gold and red. His apartment, a sleek, modern space on the Upper West Side, felt cold when he stepped inside. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, the floors polished to perfection. Everything about his life now exuded success. And yet, as he stood there, staring at his reflection in the vast windows, he felt empty. Evelyn was dying, and she had called him. He poured himself a drink, but it did little to quiet his thoughts. Sleep eluded him, and by morning, he knew there was only one thing to do. For the first time in decades, Raymond Carter packed a bag and left the city behind. The drive to Ridgeway was long, stretching over 5 hours of winding roads and empty highways. With every mile, the steel and glass of Manhattan faded, replaced by rolling hills, quiet forests, and roads that seemed to lead into the past. As he crossed into town limits, he felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. So little had changed. The same gas station still stood at the entrance to town. The same old diner with its flickering neon sign. The same tree-lined streets. It was as if time had stood still. Except for him. He was no longer the boy who had once dreamed beneath these skies, who had once held Evelyn's hand beneath the willow tree by the lake. He was a man who had left, who had broken a promise, who had chosen ambition over love, and now he was here to face it. He found her address easily. It was the same house she had grown up in, the small white cottage on the edge of town. He remembered sneaking into her yard as a teenager, throwing pebbles at her window to wake her up. He remembered the way she used to laugh, the way she used to whisper, "I love you," as if the words were secret meant only for him. But as he pulled into the driveway, those memories felt distant, like something that belonged to another life. The front door opened before he could knock, and there she was, Evelyn. The years had changed her, but not in the way he had expected. There was no bitterness in her eyes, no anger, just a quiet sadness, and something else, acceptance. "You actually came?" she murmured. Raymond swallowed. "Of course, I did." A small smile touched her lips. "I wasn't sure you would." Neither was he. She stepped aside, allowing him in. The house smelled of lavender and old books, just like he remembered. But there was something different now, a fragility in the air. In the way she moved, in the way her breath came just a little too shallow. Reality hit him then. This wasn't just a visit. This wasn't a reunion. This was goodbye. Over the next few days, Raymond stayed. At first, he told himself it was just to help, to make sure she was comfortable, to ease whatever burden she carried. But as time passed, he realized something deeper was pulling him back. She never asked him why he left. She never made him explain. And that, perhaps, was the hardest part. Because he wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her how afraid he had been, how he had convinced himself that love was a distraction, that success was the only thing that mattered. He wanted to tell her that he had thought of her every day, that he had carried her memory like a ghost in his heart. But he didn't, because none of it would change what had already been lost. Instead, they talked about the past, the good parts, the summer nights spent at the lake, the dreams they used to have, the way they once believed they could conquer the world together. And as the days passed, Raymond found himself changing. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about work, about money, about power. He was thinking about her, about what truly mattered. One night, as they sat on the porch, Evelyn reached for his hand. "Ray," she whispered. "Yeah. Do you regret it?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He looked at her, at the woman he had once loved more than anything, and he felt the weight of all the years between them. "I regret leaving," he admitted. "I regret not fighting for us." A soft smile touched her lips. "Me too." They sat in silence after that, the past heavy between them. And then she did something he didn't expect. She squeezed his hand. "But I forgive you." Raymond felt his chest tighten. He had spent years chasing everything he thought he wanted. But sitting there, with Evelyn's hand in his, he realized something. He had spent a lifetime running from the one thing that had ever truly mattered. And now, at the end of it all, she was giving him the one thing he never thought he deserved: forgiveness. Evelyn passed away 3 weeks later. Raymond stayed by her side until the very end. He was the one who held her hand as she took her final breath, the one who whispered, "I love you," when her eyes closed for the last time. And when she was gone, he knew that the last call he ever took had been a gift, a chance to make peace, a chance to remember what truly mattered, and a chance, at last, to say goodbye. Raymond Carter had spent his life running from the past, from mistakes, from love itself. He had mastered the art of burying emotions beneath contracts and courtroom battles, allowing ambition to eclipse every other part of his being. But now, in Evelyn's small cottage in Ridgeway, time moved differently. The walls held stories he had once been part of. The very air smelled of something he had long forgotten home. His days became filled with quiet moments. He would sit with Evelyn at the old wooden table in the kitchen, watching as the morning light filtered through the lace curtains. She would sip her tea slowly, her hands trembling slightly, but she never spoke of the pain she was in. Instead, she would smile and ask about his life in the city, about the cases he had won, about whether he was happy. That last question always caught him off guard, because the truth was, he didn't know. For years, he had measured happiness by his paycheck, by the power he held in a room full of executives. But here, in the presence of a dying woman, the woman he realized that none of it had ever been real. Happiness had been the sound of Evelyn's laughter on a summer night. It had been the feeling of her hand in his beneath the willow tree by the lake. It had been something he let go of long ago, convinced that success would be enough. Now, he wasn't so sure. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Evelyn sat on the porch wrapped in a knitted shawl. Raymond joined her, handing her a cup of warm chamomile tea. She smiled, cradling the cup in her hands. "You always did know how I take my tea." He chuckled softly. "Some things don't change." Evelyn tilted her head, studying him with those knowing eyes. "But some things do." Raymond exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I don't know. I look at my life now, and I wonder if I made the right choices." Evelyn took a slow sip of tea. "Do you regret leaving?" There it was, the question that had haunted him for years. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the trees, at the familiar street, at the town he had once thought was too small for him. "Back then, I thought I had to leave," he admitted. "I thought love was something that could wait, that there would always be time. But I was wrong." Evelyn sighed, setting her cup down. "I used to be angry, you know." Raymond turned to her. "I don't blame you." She nodded. "I spent years wondering what I did wrong, why I wasn't enough for you to stay. But then our life happened, and I realized that sometimes people leave not because they don't love you, but because they don't know how to stay." Raymond's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her that he had loved her more than anything, that he had left not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid that loving her would mean giving up everything else. But looking at her now, he realized she already knew, and, somehow, she had forgiven him anyway. The days passed slowly. Evelyn grew weaker, though she never complained. Raymond found himself taking care of her in ways he never thought he would, helping her to the couch, bringing her warm soup, tucking a blanket around her shoulders when the nights grew cold. And in those moments, something shifted inside him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about contracts or deadlines. He wasn't chasing something just out of reach. He was simply there, with her. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Evelyn asked him to sit beside her on the bed. "Ray," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand. She smiled faintly. "I want you to promise me something." "Anything?" She exhaled, closing her eyes for a moment before looking at him again. "When I'm gone, don't go back to the life you had before." Raymond's heart clenched. "Evelyn." "Promise me," she interrupted gently. "Promise me you'll find something real, something that makes you feel again." He swallowed hard. For so long, he had believed that success meant sacrificing emotion. But Evelyn, even in her final days, was teaching him the most important lesson of all. Life wasn't about power. It wasn't about money. It was about love. About the moments that made life worth living. "I promise," he whispered. And for the first time in years, he meant it. Evelyn passed away on a quiet Sunday morning. Raymond held her hand as she took her last breath, his heart breaking in a way he hadn't thought possible. But as he sat there, the weight of her loss pressing down on him, he also felt something else. Peace. Because in those last weeks, he had been given something rare. A second chance. A chance to say goodbye. A chance to tell her he loved her. A chance to be the man he should have been all along. After the funeral, Raymond didn't return to the city. Instead, he stayed in Ridgeway. He spent days by the lake, remembering the girl who once sat beside him, dreaming of forever. He visited the old bookstore where they used to spend rainy afternoons, flipping through pages they never bought. And, in time, he started to live again. Not the way he once had, chasing wealth, power, prestige, but in a way that mattered. He took a job at the town's small legal office, helping people who couldn't afford big-time law years. He coached a little league team, teaching kids the joy of baseball. He spent nights staring at the stars, remembering Evelyn's laughter, feeling her presence in the wind. And he realized something. The last call he ever took hadn't just been a goodbye. It had been a beginning, a second chance at the life he had once left behind, a chance to be the man Evelyn always believed he could be. And for that, he would always be grateful. The weight of regret. The town of Ridgeway moved at a different pace than the life Raymond had known in New York. Here, people greeted each other by name, and small gestures held great significance. A warm loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a neighbour stopping by just to chat, a handwritten note of thanks for a favour done without expectation of return. Raymond had never noticed these things before, or maybe he had never been in a place where they mattered. But now they did. He spent his mornings at the law office, working with Thomas on cases that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with people's lives. He had once measured success by the number of deals he closed now. It was in the relief on a mother's face when she won custody of her child, in the gratitude of a struggling family when he helped them keep their home. But the nights were harder. At night, the house felt too big, too quiet. It wasn't just Evelyn's absence that haunted him. It was the weight of everything left unsaid, of the time he had wasted believing he could always come back. One evening, as he sat by the old fireplace with a glass of whiskey in hand, he let himself truly feel it. The regret, the years he had spent convincing himself that leaving had been the right choice, that he was building something worthwhile, something bigger than love. But love had been the only thing that mattered, and he had walked away from it. He ran his fingers over the armrest of the chair Evelyn had once curled up in. Closing his eyes, he could almost hear her laughter, the way she used to tease him for taking life too seriously. "Ray, do you ever just stop thinking and enjoy the moment?" She had asked him that once, years ago when they sat by the lake, watching the stars, and he never had, until now. Letters from the past. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, Raymond found an old wooden box tucked beneath a pile of forgotten blankets. Dust coated its surface, but the initials EL was still visible. His breath caught in his throat. Evelyn's letters. His hand shook as he opened the box, revealing stacks of neatly folded envelopes, each one addressed to him. Letters she had written but never sent. He hesitated before picking up the first one, unfolding it carefully. "Raymond," it began in her familiar handwriting. "I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I need to say these things, even if you never read them. I used to believe you'd come back, that one day I'd look up and see you standing on my porch, saying you made a mistake. But years passed, and you never did. So I learned to let go. Or at least, I tried." Raymond exhaled shakily, his heart pounding in his chest. He read through letter after letter. each one revealing more of her pain, her hope, her quiet acceptance that he was never coming back. And yet, even in her sadness, there was never bitterness, never anger, only love. I hope you're happy, Ray, I really do. But I also hope you remember what it felt like to love someone with your whole heart. Because I'll never forget. By the time he finished, tears streamed down his face. She had never hated him for leaving, but she had never stopped loving him either. And now he would carry that truth for the rest of his life. Atonement and healing. The letters changed something in him. For so long, he had believed that regret was a weight he would carry forever. But now he saw it differently. Maybe regret wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was a lesson. And maybe, just maybe, it was a second chance in disguise. So he started doing the things he had once been too afraid to do. He wrote letters to Evelyn, to himself, to the man he had once been and the man he was trying to become. He visited the lake more often, sitting beneath the willow tree where they had once dreamed of the future. He talked to her there, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. But maybe, in some way, she could. One day, he met Evelyn's niece, Margaret, a woman in her early 30s with the same sharp wit and warm smile. She had come back to Ridgeway to settle some of Evelyn's affairs. And when she found out Raymond was staying in the house, she had been hesitant at first. I never understood why my aunt forgave you, she admitted one afternoon as they sat on the porch. Raymond sighed. Neither did I. Margaret studied him for a long moment before nodding. But I think I do now. Raymond looked at her, questioning. She forgave you because she knew you'd come back someday, Margaret said. Maybe not in the way she wanted, but in the way you needed. And maybe, Margaret was right, a love that never truly dies. Time passed, and life in Ridgeway slowly became his own. He found himself spending more time with Clara, sharing quiet conversations over coffee, walking through town together as the seasons changed. He would never love anyone the way he loved Evelyn. But love had many forms, and the heart had room for more than one kind of love. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace, he took out the last letter Evelyn had written, the one she had addressed to him, but never sent. Ray, it read, if you're reading this, it means you finally came home. And that's all I ever wanted. Not for me, but for you. I hope you find peace here. I hope you find love again. I hope you forgive yourself, because I forgave you a long time ago. And Ray, live. Please, just live. He pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes burning with tears. Then, for the first time in his life, he truly let go. Of the past, of the regret, of the man he used to be. And he stepped forward into the life he was meant to live. The last call that changed everything. Raymond Carter had spent his life answering calls that promised power, wealth, prestige. But in the end, the most important call he ever took was the one he almost ignored. A call that pulled him back to the past. A call that gave him the chance to say goodbye. A call that led him home. And because of that one call, he found something he never thought he'd have again. A reason to stay. A reason to love. A reason to live. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. Raymond settled into life in Ridgeway with a quiet acceptance. He no longer viewed it as temporary, nor did he see himself as an outsider merely passing through. He was home, but healing was not a straight path. There were still nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of all he had lost. Some mornings, he found himself reaching for his phone, instinctively expecting a work email or a conference call, before remembering that part of his life was over. And then there were the moments when he still felt Evelyn's presence walking, past her favorite cafe, hearing an old song on the radio, seeing her handwriting in the margins of a book. Grief was a quiet thing. It did not announce itself with grand gestures. It crept in through the smallest of moments. But alongside grief, something else grew. Hope, not in the way he had once defined it, Not a hope for success or power, but a quiet, steady hope that life still held meaning, that there was still joy to be found, even after loss, that he was still capable of love, building a new life. Raymond's work at the law office became more than just a job, it became a calling. Thomas, his mentor turned friend, often joked that he had gone from being a shark in the corporate world to a watchdog for the people who truly needed help. You know, Thomas said one afternoon as they sat outside the office, sipping coffee, when you first walked through that door, I thought you'd last maybe a week before running back to New York. Raymond smirked. So did I. And now? Raymond glanced around the small town. The place that had once felt too small for him but now felt just right. Now, I don't think I could ever go back. Thomas nodded approvingly. Good, because we need you here. And for the first time in a long time, Raymond felt needed for the right reasons. Clara Evans had become a quiet, steady presence in his life. At first, they were just two people who happened to cross paths often at the grocery store, at town events, on walks through the park. But over time, a friendship formed. Clara was different from anyone Raymond had ever known. She was practical yet warm, independent yet deeply connected to the people around her. A teacher for over 20 years, she had a way of making people feel seen, truly seen. One evening, as they sat outside the diner, sipping coffee, Clara looked at him thoughtfully. You know, she said, Evelyn talked about you sometimes. Raymond's grip tightened around his cup. She did. Clara nodded. Not often. She wasn't one to dwell on the past. But when she did, she always spoke about you with kindness. Raymond swallowed the lump in his throat. I don't deserve that. Clara tilted her head. Maybe not. But love isn't about who deserves what. It just is. Her words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. Maybe he would never be able to make up for the time he had lost. But maybe, just maybe, he could still honor the love Evelyn had given him by living the kind of life she would have wanted for him, letting go of the past. One afternoon, Raymond returned to Evelyn's house with a new sense of purpose. For months, he had been hesitant to change anything, afraid that moving forward meant letting go of the past. But now, he realized that holding on too tightly was its own kind of prison. So, he began making small changes. He repainted the walls, choosing colors that felt warm and inviting. He filled the bookshelves with new titles, mixing them in with Evelyn's old favorites. He kept her things, her photographs, her letters, the little trinkets that made the house feel like her, but he also made space for new memories. For the first time in years, the house felt less like a shrine to the past and more like a home for the present. A love that looks different. Raymond and Clara never rushed anything. What grew between them was slow, natural, built on quiet moments rather than grand gestures. One evening, as they walked by the lake, Clara paused, looking up at the stars. I used to come here with my husband, she said softly. Raymond glanced at her. Do you miss him? Every day. She smiled sadly. But missing him doesn't mean I can't be happy now. Raymond nodded, understanding more than she realized. He reached for her hand, and she let him. It wasn't the same as what he had with Evelyn, but it didn't have to be. Love didn't replace what was lost. It simply made room for something new. The final letter. One evening, Raymond sat at his desk and took out a blank sheet of paper. For months, he had been reading Evelyn's letters, holding on to her words like lifelines. But now, it was his turn to write. Evelyn, he began. I don't know if you can hear me, but I need to say this anyway. For so long, I carried the weight of my mistakes, of all the time I lost. But I'm learning that regret isn't meant to be a punishment, it's a lesson. And I'm finally listening. I stayed, Eve. I built a life here. And it's a good life. I think you'd be proud. I still love you. I always will. But I'm learning to love what's here, too. To open my heart again, to live. Thank you for waiting for me, even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for loving me, even from afar. I hope, wherever you are, you're happy. And I hope you know that I am, too. He folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box with the rest of Evelyn's letters. Then he exhaled, feeling lighter than he had in years. A future worth living for. Life moved forward, as it always did. Raymond continued his work at the law office, finding fulfillment in helping those who needed it most. He and Clara spent more time together, their bond deepening into something neither of them had expected but both welcomed. And as the seasons changed, so did he. One evening, as he stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he whispered one final goodbye to Evelyn, not with sadness, but with gratitude, because in the end, love had never truly left him. It had only changed form, and because of one last call, a call he almost didn't take, he had been given the greatest gift of all. A second chance, at love, at life, at something real, and this time he wouldn't waste it. The town of Ridgeway moved through the seasons with a quiet grace. Spring arrived with its gentle rains and new blossoms, washing away the remnants of winter's chill. Raymond found himself drawn to the lake more often, sitting beneath the willow tree where he and Evelyn had once dreamed of the future. This time, though, he wasn't trapped in the past. Instead, he let the memories settle around him like a comforting presence rather than a haunting one. As the days grew longer, he immersed himself further into the town's rhythms, helping Thomas at the law office, volunteering at the community centre, joining Sunday morning gatherings at the local diner where stories were exchanged over coffee and warm pastries. He had never been the kind of man to linger in one place before, but now he understood the beauty of staying. And then there was Clara. Their friendship deepened, built not on grand, romantic gestures but on steady companionship, conversations on long walks, quiet evenings spent reading side by side, the warmth of knowing someone was simply there. One evening, as they sat on her front porch watching fireflies dance through the dusk, Clara spoke softly. "You're different now, Ray?" He turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "How so?" She smiled. "When you first came back, you carried your past like a weight you couldn't put down. But now, it's like you've learned how to carry it differently." Raymond exhaled, her words settling deep. "I think I have. A town that heals." Ridgeway had a way of taking in the broken and offering them a place to mend. Raymond saw it in the people who had lived there for decades, people like Thomas, who had once left for the city, only to return when he realised home wasn't something he could outrun. He saw it in Margaret, Evelyn's niece, who had initially been wary of him, but now greeted him with genuine warmth whenever they crossed paths. He saw it in himself. He wasn't the same man who had left Evelyn behind all those years ago, and he wasn't the same man who had returned, drowning in regret. He had found purpose, meaning, not in wealth, not in power, but in something real, something lasting. A letter never sent, a life moving forward. One autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted from the trees, Raymond found himself in Evelyn's old study, sifting through the box of letters once more. This time, though, he wasn't searching for closure. He had already found it. Instead, he added one more letter to the stack, the letter he had written to Evelyn months ago, the one where he had finally let go. He placed it carefully among the others, then closed the box, not to forget, but to honour, because love wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about carrying it with you in a way that made the present richer. That evening, as he and Clara walked through town, she reached for his hand without hesitation, and he let her, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as a new beginning. And for the first time in his life, Raymond Carter wasn't looking back. He was looking forward, towards something real, towards something lasting, toward home. The weight of memory and the lightness of now. As autumn deepened, Ridgeway took on a golden glow. The air turned crisp, and the scent of burning wood lingered in the evenings. Raymond found comfort in the town's steady rhythm, the quiet hum of life that was neither rushed nor stagnant. Yet, despite the peace he had found, there were still moments when the past pressed in. One evening, as he walked by Evelyn's old cafe, he found himself stopping by the window. The glow of the hanging lights reflected warmly on the glass, and inside, couples sat close, hands curled around steaming cups of coffee. He used to meet Evelyn there when they were young. She had loved the corner table by the window, always choosing the seat where she could watch the world outside. He smiled at the memory, but didn't feel the same ache he once did. Instead, he stepped inside. The barista, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted him. "Haven't seen you in here before. I used to come here a long time ago," he said. "It's been a while." "Well, welcome back," she said, handing him a menu. "Take your time." He settled into a chair, not Evelyn's favourite corner, but one that felt right for him. A new place for a new beginning. An unexpected visit. A few weeks later, a knock at his door startled him from his reading. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Margaret standing there. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," Raymond said, stepping aside. Margaret had been wary of him since he returned, and he didn't blame her. He had left Evelyn behind, and in many ways, Margaret had been the one to pick up the pieces. They sat in the living room, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Margaret exhaled and met his gaze. "I found something," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small, worn envelope and placed it on the table between them. Raymond's heart stuttered when he saw Evelyn's handwriting on the front. "I was going through some of her old things," Margaret continued, "and I found this. She wrote it years ago, but she never sent it." His fingers trembled as he picked up the envelope. Margaret stood. "I thought you should have it." He swallowed hard. "Thank you." She nodded, then hesitated. "She never stopped loving you, you know." Raymond closed his eyes. "I never stopped loving her either." Margaret gave him a small, sad smile, then left. Alone, Raymond stared at the envelope, his breath uneven. Then, with careful fingers, he opened it. Evelyn's final words. "Raymond, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll ever send it. But I need to write it anyway. I spent years wondering why you left, why you chose the life you did. I used to think it was because I wasn't enough. That if I had loved you better, you would have stayed. But I understand now. You weren't running from me. You were running from yourself. I hope, wherever you are, you find what you're looking for. I hope you stop running. And I hope, one day, you remember that love isn't something you can outrun. It stays, even when we don't. Evelyn." Raymond let out a shaky breath. She had known. Even then, she had understood him better than he had understood himself. The letter wasn't a goodbye. It was a reminder. Love doesn't disappear. It lingers. It shapes. It waits. And it was still with him. The gift of the present. The first snowfall of winter dusted Ridgeway in white. Raymond stood on his porch, watching the way the streetlights illuminated the falling flakes. He felt something shift inside him, something quiet but powerful. He thought about the man he had been, the one who had left Evelyn, who had chased ambition and let love slip through his fingers. Then he thought about the man he had become, a man who had learned to stay, a man who had found purpose beyond power, a man who had chosen love, even in its quietest, simplest form. As he turned to step inside, he found Clara standing in the doorway, watching him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He stepped toward her, reached for her hand, and held it. Not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a man who had finally learned how to love in the present. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't haunted by what could have been. He was grateful for what was, for what is, for what will be. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. The shape of love and the lessons of loss. The days grew colder, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine and the promise of snow. Christmas lights began to appear along the main street, their warm glow reflecting off shop windows. Raymond found himself walking through town more often, taking in the quiet beauty of the season. Ridgeway had never been his town, not in the way New York had been, not in the way his past life had been marked by skyscrapers, traffic, and the constant hum of ambition. But it had become something even more precious. It had become home. And with that realization came an acceptance of something deeper. Love was not just a single moment in time. It was not confined to one relationship or one person. It was something that evolved, something that changed shape but never truly disappeared. He had loved Evelyn. He would always love her. But that love had transformed. It was no longer an ache, no longer a ghost that haunted him. It had settled into something quieter, a memory that lived inside him, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how deeply he was capable of loving. And now he had Clara, not as a replacement, not as a second choice, but as a new beginning, a love that looked different, a love that felt different, a love that was here, a Christmas unlike any other. The first time Raymond truly realized how much his life had changed was on Christmas Eve. He had spent so many years avoiding holidays, burying himself in work to distract from the emptiness. Even when he and Evelyn had been together, he had often been too preoccupied with business deals to appreciate the traditions she had cherished. But this year was different. He found himself in Clara's kitchen, helping her prepare Christmas dinner. She moved with easy grace, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables and stirred sauces. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasting turkey, and in the living room, the fireplace crackled softly. Margaret arrived later with her husband and their 2 children, their laughter filling the home. Thomas and his wife stopped by with a bottle of wine, and before long, the small house was filled with the warmth of good company. Raymond sat back and watched it all unfold, the people he had come to love, the home that had become his own, the quiet peace that settled inside him. Clara caught his eye from across the table, smiling softly. And in that moment, he understood something he had never truly believed before. Happiness was not something you chased. It was something you built. And he had finally built something worth holding on to. On New Year's Eve, Raymond sat alone in his study, staring at Evelyn's letter. He had read it dozens of times, memorized every word. But tonight felt different. Tonight, it was time to let go, not to forget, not to erase, but to truly move forward. He stood, walked to the fireplace, and hesitated only for a moment before placing the letter into the flames. As the paper curled and blackened, he whispered softly, "Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for loving me, even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for waiting for me, even when I couldn't see it. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't fade, it only changes." And as the last of the ashes drifted upward, Raymond felt lighter than he had in years, a future worth holding on to. Spring returned, and with it, a sense of renewal. Raymond and Clara spent more time together, their relationship growing into something steady, something sure. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Clara reached for his hand. "Are you happy, Ray?" she asked softly. He turned to her, truly seeing her, this woman who had stood beside him, who had given him space to heal without trying to fix him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "I really am." She squeezed his hand, and in the quiet of that moment, he knew that his past no longer held him captive. He had learned what it meant to love, to stay, to truly live. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The seasons passed, and with them, so did the last remnants of the man Raymond Carter used to be. He no longer woke with the weight of regret pressing against his ribs. He no longer measured his life in missed opportunities or paths untaken. Instead, he counted the days by the laughter shared over morning coffee with Clara, by the warmth of a neighbour's greeting as he walked through town, by the quiet peace of a sunset reflecting over the lake, where he and Evelyn had once dreamed. Ridgeway had become more than a refuge. It had become home. And then, one spring morning, as Raymond sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee, his phone rang. A sound so ordinary, a sound that had once dictated his life. He stared at the screen for a long moment. A New York number, a past he no longer belonged to. For years, every call had been a summons, an urgent demand from an office that had consumed him. from a world where love had been a casualty of ambition. But now he had a choice. He let it ring. And then, with the simplest, most profound sense of peace, he silenced the phone and set it aside. That was the last call he ever took. Not because he was running, not because he feared what lay beyond it, but because he had finally chosen something greater than success. He had chosen life. He had chosen love. He had chosen to stay. The moral of the story: happiness is not something waiting for us in the distance. It is not hidden in ambition, wealth, or the next great achievement. It is built in the moments we choose to be present. It is found in the love we nurture, the kindness we give, and the people who make a place feel like home. Sometimes, the most important call we can answer is the one that leads us back to ourselves. And sometimes, the most powerful choice we can make is to let go, to stop running to stay.